Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Storytime. I am Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. And so this is Storytime. Sometimes I read biblical passages and make a story time of it, offer commentary, my own very feminist, no holds barred, just full on commentary. Sometimes I bring on scholars or people who've written books that I think are really interesting and important. And so today is one of the scholar options, and I'm really excited to introduce you to and to have a conversation with Jennifer Glancy. First, I want to touch on a couple things of business, and then I'll bring her on, I'll introduce her and bring her on. So I wanted to let you all know that for those of you who are supporting me through Patreon, this is the third Thursday of the month. So tonight is the live conversation. If you're interested in hanging out and chatting for a while, it's at this point, we don't have a specific theme for tonight. So we're just going to talk about whatever you want to talk about. And it's 8 p.m. Eastern US. And we have people joining us from Switzerland, and we have people from the West Coast. And so it's just kind of fun hanging out time to talk. If you'd like to do that, it's just an hour. The other thing is, I know that some of you also follow the Diablo Critics, and we had a pretty intense conversation on Sunday. They usually are. And there was some pushback from Gavin, the guy we were responding to. Specifically, he pushed back on some of the things I said, which all kinds of things to say about that. But there was a lot of banter in the last couple of days, and I decided that I will just do my own response to him, to that specific video, doing my version of it, and which is going to have a very different focus than the one we did on Sunday, because the one on Sunday is very much about the text, the Deuteronomy 21 and other ancient Near Eastern contexts and all the things that my buddies bring to the table. So my version will be next week's story time. And so I think some of you might appreciate that, knowing that that's coming, and to look for that. So I think that's all the kind of the business I needed to touch on. So today I'm talking with another New Testament professor, professor of New Testament, and her name is Jennifer A. Glancy, and she is the Reverend Kevin G. O'Connell, S.J., distinguished teaching professor in the Humanities, and she teaches at Lemoyne College. She was a 2018 fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies. And if you want to see a really interesting group of people and important work that's happening, go check that out, the ACLS, and just go see who some of these fellows are. I learned about it here by learning about Jennifer's work, and it was my introduction to them. Really interesting things happening. I was pleased to learn about that, and it says impressive things about her, I think. I realized I forgot to update my information about her current work. So I'm going to ask her to just clarify that, since I forgot to update that in my notes. But she has written several very important books. And the one that I'm familiar with is her book on slavery and early Christianity. And she just released an updated or expanded edition. It's like twice the size of the first version. And I'm so pleased. I had people telling me for years that I needed to read this. And I was like, oh, I think whatever, it would be good. I'm sure there's something interesting. But when Stephen Moore says this will change everything for you, it's like, and Stephen Moore is a colleague I deeply respect and appreciate in terms of his work. It's like, oh, well, let me, like when you put it that way, you'd think you wouldn't need someone to say that in order to take someone else's scholarship that seriously, but I needed it. And there you go. It changed everything. It was great. It's amazing. And so very pleased to have her on to talk about that. And also for those of you watching and might want to have questions for her at the end, which we'll do at the end, let me just do a little shout out about her other interests. So the things that she brings to the table are the things she looks at, the lenses she uses, the methodologies she engages. She's interested in gender theory, also comparative studies of slavery. So a lot of work around slavery and embodiment, corporeality and Christian anthropology, cultural history of early Christianity, women's history in antiquity. So she's bringing all those kinds of things to the work she does. So I am like, no further ado, let's bring her on.
Okay.
Hi, Jennifer. Welcome to Storytime.
Well, Dr. Jennifer Bird, thank you very much. And I just want to say, I really think that doing these kind of conversations is such a treat for anyone who's a biblical scholar,
Mm.
anyone who wants to write, wants to have people read their work, but we also want to share our ideas. So it's a chance for me to talk about some of my publication, but also some of my ideas and see how they land when I'm not in the classroom or something like that. So just a couple of things about my books. So this
Sure.
was the first edition of Slavery and Early Christianity, 1982, Oxford University Press. Woohoo! It was a big thrill for me.
Yeah,
It came out
that
in
is.
1986 by
I have
Fortress,
I have
new
that
cover.
version. Mhm.
And they now have this new version that came out with Fortress as an expanded edition. If you have read the older editions, you don't really need to read the new edition. One reason that it's expanded is that it's just a bigger typeset font.
Is
I'm
that
not
is that
kidding
I
you.
was
So
wondering.
there's
Yeah.
part of it is just that it's a bigger font. There's a preface by my wonderful editor, Daniel Jose
Oh,
Camacho. There's an afterword
nice.
that I wrote, and
Nice.
the index is officially more helpful than it used to be. So
Great.
it's not as helpful as it could have been if the press had taken Dr. Bird's suggestions, um, it's better. And then I do have this, what I always say, the little book. This is Slavery as Moral Problem in the Early Church. It's
Mhm.
also a really, and today, it's a nice little book. My current book project is called Selling Joseph, Biblical Slavery and the Humanities, and it grows out of the works that I was funded to do, in 2017, 2018, but a lot of things have happened in my life and in the world since then, and so
Mm.
the project kind of shifted.
Mhm.
So I can talk more about that later, but let's
Yeah.
enough show and tell for now.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that, and I knew it was something about Joseph, and
Yeah,
we chatted about that briefly
yeah,
last, I think, at one
yeah.
point. Thank you, that's helpful, and I do have some of your titles, the images to share if we wanna go back to that or whatever to talk about them. But you're here, and I would love to start with a little bit about why you do what you do. And the way I ask scholars, the way I ask my guests to do that and to talk about that is to whatever extent you're comfortable sharing with us, you know, formative moments or experiences in your childhood or things that you engaged that kind of set you on a trajectory that you didn't, like that you later look back and were like, oh, that was that. Or, the advocacy activist work you did in undergrad, any piece of your story that would help us relate to you, understand you better, and that also shines a light on why you've chosen what you've chosen.
Okay. Well, that's a lot. So why don't
It
I
is.
start in a couple different directions, and
Okay.
then we'll see what you think is more interesting. So, I guess I could think about how I got to be an academic because I'm the only academic in my family. I'm one of 6 children. I grew up in a nice, very happy Catholic family in the 1960s and 70s. I was born in 1960, and so I so that was my upbringing, and but the others just really weren't really into school particularly, and I
Huh.
loved it.
Huh.
I was a kid who loved to read, but we all loved to read in my family.
Mhm. Mhm.
No matter how you felt about college, good idea, bad idea, we all loved to read.
Huh.
Yeah, so I was like the kind of kid who'd get, like it's not like a particular book. It's just
Mhm.
like, you could get lost in reading. And I don't know, have you had that same thing, Jennifer? It's harder as an adult to get really lost in a book the way you
Yes.
could when you're a kid, and you're
Yes.
just, like, inside. You're reading Little Women or something, and you're just inside that world. For me now, maybe now, like, if I'm on a really long airplane trip where I've really nothing else to do, I could do it, but normally not so much. When I was a kid once,
Mm.
uh, once I was in the living room and I saw these firefighters trooping out of my house.
Oh, geez.
Oh, geez, yeah. And so I go like, Mom,
Mhm.
Mom, what the heck? Well, we
Yeah.
said fire. In those days, we said firemen. Why
Huh.
are these firemen? Of course we did, right? So
Right,
why are
right.
these? And she's like, what are you doing in the house? And I'm like, well, I'm reading. And she goes, what do you mean you're reading? You're supposed to be out of the house, right? Like you're supposed to be out. And she said, I told everyone to leave the house.
Oh my
There's a
gosh.
fire in the dryer.
You
And then
didn't
she
even
said,
hear her.
yeah, well, and then she goes like, "Wait, you were reading in the living room?" She said, "They trooped in, right, like, they went, like, through." And I'm like, "Well, I was reading,"
You were so in the zone.
I was, like, reading, I wasn't, like,
You
paying attention to the world outside. So that's the kind of kid I was, and,
Nice,
But
nice.
anyway,
I like that
um,
you said I'm gonna do mine. I mean, you said you're from a happy Catholic family. I thought that was kind of an interesting
yeah, yeah,
comment, and I think I know what you mean by that, right? It just no drama, but just very not super Catholic-y, but just a Catholic family. Is that what you mean by that?
yeah, I think so, and I also like I have a lot of critiques of Catholic teaching on lots of issues, especially around gender and sexuality, not only, but frequently around gender, sexuality.
Yeah.
But when I say that, I would say, like, but it's not like I was damaged. I know many people who were damaged, and I
Yeah.
really connect, and I see how that happens,
Yeah.
and but
Yeah.
but that's also it like, my parents we went to mass
Yeah.
every Sunday,
Right.
like, totally every Sunday.
Right.
Went to mass, if you know, Catholics have holy days of obligation. August 15th, we'd be at the beach for a week, like, we'd leave the beach and drive to go to mass for,
For this special thing. Okay.
for this
Uh-huh.
special thing.
Yeah.
So we did that, but it wasn't like we didn't say the rosary together. Like I
Uh-huh.
knew how to say the rosary, but a lot of Catholics of my age will be like, "Oh, and we said the rosary on Sunday night," and I'll be like, "Oh, you did?"
Yes.
It wasn't
Okay.
like that.
Yeah.
I didn't go to like if you have a picture of a Catholic church in this like really dark and
Mhm. Mhm.
incense and really great stuff like that. I was like in like a 1965 church that has like felt banners on the wall with like the Holy Spirit coming down as a
Yes.
felt
Yes.
kind of bird, right? So
Right.
that's the kind that was the aesthetic. We were singing, they'll know we are Christians by our love. I mean, it was great. It was
Uh-huh.
fine.
It was a yeah, yeah.
It
No,
was it was a fine. It was a post Vatican II moment, and we were observant, and
okay.
you know
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
wasn't a lot of like my mother would see me reading saints' lives, and of course, like all the people are traumatized by reading those, right? Like people are just traumatized by reading, and I'm like totally into it, like all the martyrs and everything. And my mother would be like, "Oh, for God's sakes, go, put that down
What's
already.
wrong with you?
It's not even healthy for you to be
Right,
reading
right,
that.
for a child to be reading these things.
That's really not good for you." So that's kind of yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you, right.
Yeah.
There and a lot of
Someone's saying Elisa is saying she's intrigued by the rosary. I would still say the rosary actually in some ways it's a meditative practice. I mean, I've taught a course called What Does Prayer Do? And one of the things as we look at and the students are like, "Oh, meditation, that's cool." Well, every religious tradition has and so when
something. Uh-huh.
I say the rosary, it's not like a deep devotion to the rosary. It's just like it can be like a way of z if you do any
Regulating. Yeah,
tuning in, but sort of by shutting other stuff out,
yeah,
so,
yep,
yeah. So,
yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so and it's interesting too when you t yeah, you weren't traumatized by it all, and so your work is not fueled by hurt in the past or trying to address similar
Mhm, mhm,
abuse or pain that
mhm,
that you experience,
mhm,
which I think is helpful to note up front,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
You do have very, critical engagements for sure,
Mm.
but there's not the same kind of
I'm laughing because someone said my mother-in-law had calluses from counting beads. Sorry, that's just like a
I'm glad
it
you're
wasn't like
tracking.
that wasn't like that for
No.
me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm glad you're able to
Yeah.
track with the comments. Since we're briefly doing a little comment, the very first 2 comments, I wanted to make sure you saw that James Apperson, mentioned
Oh,
your work, and just did a stream, I guess, about
oh,
slavery
that's
in early
great. Thank you.
Christianity or about your work. I'm not quite sure which, but,
Okay.
anyway, so
Thanks, James. Thank you,
yeah,
James.
yeah. Um, okay, so more back so okay, so Catholic upbringing,
Yeah.
nice Catholic upbringing, you're very curious intellectually, love to absorb and get into the worlds of these
Mhm,
books.
mhm.
So, you shared a little bit with me in our exchanges about the social work or the activist work, sorry,
Yeah,
that you were
yeah.
involved in undergrad. Can you say more
Yeah,
about
and
that?
even I think it's just I would say undergrad, but also then just post undergrad. So I was very sort of taken, actually, as I still am, by sort of messages about social justice that are biblically based, and took them very seriously, and kind of and on in a way that I can't be ironic about. I'm
Mhm.
ironic and sardonic about lots of things, but I really can't. And I'm like, okay, okay, when I'm in my classroom, you know what? I really don't think Jesus cares how you identify in terms of gender. I mean, he goes like, "Hey, some have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God." I
Right.
don't think he's really hung up on your gender identity. Um, But I do think he really cares how you treat the poor. They're like,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, I know." And, like, by the end of the semester, the students are rolling their eyes. "I know, like, you gotta care about the poor." I'm like, "Yeah, you kinda do." So, so after college, I was involved with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which was working as it's
Huh.
sort of like Vista or the Peace
Is it?
Corps,
Okay.
but it was
Yeah.
sponsored by the Jesuits, and so I lived in Philadelphia for 2 years. I know there are people I've already seen. We've got some friends from Philadelphia here. Um, so I lived in Philadelphia, and the first year, I guess I would say I lived at 4th and Jefferson, if you know Philadelphia, which is
Just a
and
little
I
bit.
lived
Yeah.
at 30th and Broad, so that's more for the people um, and this would be 1982 to 83 that I lived there, and then 83 to 84, I lived in a shelter for formerly homeless women, a sort of a caretaking apartment and a
Hmm.
shelter for formerly homeless women, and
Oh,
that was
wow.
downtown at 11th and Spruce.
Oh,
So I
cool.
did that kind of work, and that was really sort of a deep sort of knowing that I wanted to go to graduate school, knowing that I wanted to teach, and even more. I mean, this is knowing that I wanted to be in school, that I wanted to study, that I wanted to write even more than I knew what I wanted to study or write about. It wasn't like I
Mhm.
was so into the Bible, so I had to get a PhD. It was more like, I am going to do this graduate school thing. What should I study?
Okay.
And so that might be kind of a backwards way of seeing it.
For some
And
people, yeah, right. That's fine.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
and I'm
interesting.
looking at Lisa, "No, it takes a lot more to offend me. If you're trying to offend me, you're gonna have to try harder." Um, so, it yeah, but I just really thought like I needed to be in the world and be away from, the ivory tower, or I was gonna say ivory tower, ivy tower. Which
Uh-huh.
is Ivory Tower? I forget which it is,
It's
but
ivory.
anyway,
I think it's ivory tower.
Ivy
Yeah.
Covered Ivy Tower.
Yeah.
I needed to get away from that and have other kinds of experiences, and that really is that commitment to justice and peace, and coming to understand that too in a feminist lens, in a way, and to understand. My first experiences with feminist theology were with other sort of people in that cohort, and sort of working that out together and figuring out what that was going to look like, at that moment, at that place and time, was really formative for me.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and sort
Hmm.
of has, I think, probably then eventually influence the kind of research that I did, as I tried to find something that I was going to find totally compelling, because I was sort of splashing around trying to find what I was going to write about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
So, okay. So, yeah, there's not a direct like, and then this happened, and then that's why I
no,
decided on biblical. It was more just your interests, and
yeah,
then you, yeah.
yeah. It's true. I went to graduate school in the Bible without having read the Bible, and I don't mean like with having read it from cover to cover. But like, it's probably literally true that there's not a single book of the Bible that I had read the entirety of. Mhm.
To this day, or when you went to
Oh
grad
my
school?
god! Oh, come on, Dr. Bird.
I just had to ask.
Maybe by the time I went to graduate school, maybe I had read the Gospels,
Okay.
I mean, I certainly heard scripture preached in the lectionary, but no, I had not read Genesis cover to, from
Yeah,
front to
the
back. I
whole
had not
right?
read the book of Revelation.
Right,
I
right.
didn't know what Paul's letters. I mean, I kind of I hadn't read that. I was just like, I know Greek. Like, I started studying Greek when I was 18. I know Greek.
Okay.
So, I
Yeah.
might as well do something with it.
Right, right. And to
And I'm
clarify,
being overly glib. I also did it because what I had heard about it was pretty great. Like, it's like, oh, this is really, really great. Yeah. So connecting someone with
huh,
Dorothy Day and the Catholic Quaker here. So it was, I knew that these were really, really um, uh, important texts for people's lives. They're important texts for people's spirituality, and they were important texts politically. I knew they were important in American history, and I didn't want to be in some field where it was just a bunch of academics, talking to each other.
huh.
So, yeah.
Have you found many in biblical studies who are of sorry, I just had to say it. I'm sorry. I think
So
my
then,
filter's turned off today.
no, what I
There are
do find,
there are. I don't mean to be
what I
rude.
do think that whatever we do in biblical studies, I think there are a lot of people out there in the world, and
Mhm.
many of the people who are hanging out with us today and sharing their thoughts with us today and distracting me and making
Yeah.
me laugh inappropriately.
Right,
Um,
right,
I will have to speak to you after class quietly about this behavior.
right.
So,
No.
there are a lot of adults and teens and other people in the world who are interested in the material that we study and who
Yeah.
are finding ways to connect with it. And left to my own devices, I can get really arcane. I can get like super obscure. Like if you want me to recommend one of my articles that you should never read
Yeah.
unless you really want to like be bored
Yeah.
out of your mind, I can do that.
Yeah.
So I can get really obscure,
Right.
and yet then I keep coming back to, but we're talking about things that are actually really important and that have an important impact on our society and our lives and how we see each other and how we relate to each other. So,
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, so what got you interested? I'm assuming so you were in graduate school, you told me 84 to 90, is that right? So
That's right.
you're yeah, so
Mhm.
you're so the slavery and early Christianity was your dissertation or was based off of no, what was your dissertation topic?
Oh, my dissertation topic. So, Slavery and Early Christianity came out in 2002.
Okay.
My dissertation, which I submitted and defended in spring of 1990,
Yeah.
was called, wait for it, Satan in the Synoptic Gospels.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I almost like my students on because my students always think we're gonna be talking about the devil a whole lot more than we are. Like, when I teach Hebrew Bible, Old Testament,
Mhm.
and they're like, "When do we do the devil?" I'm like, "Really, we're not going to, because
It's
it's the Hebrew
it's
Bible.
like
Like,
a
this one
little yeah,
this
it's
will
a
really
little
not
yeah.
really like be here." And they're like and I'm like, "Really, trust me. I'm one of the world experts on Satan." Or I was at one point. I
Yeah.
kinda at one point I said, "Get behind me, Satan." Mhm.
Uh-huh, right.
Satan in the Synoptic Gospels. Mhm.
Yeah. Wow, that I didn't see that coming, yeah.
Nope.
And you'd never had that no, you'd
No,
maybe
I
just
never
did
had that
articles with it.
published, thank
Mhm,
God. No,
yeah,
I'm sure it would have been fine. It was like a lot
mhm,
of other dissertations at
yeah,
that time. It's like
okay.
intro chapter, chapter on
Yeah,
Matthew, chapter on Mark, chapter on Luke. I guess it would have
right,
been Mark, Matthew, Luke.
yeah,
And then like
yeah.
summary. It was fine. Like
Yeah, you did the
it was
work and
fine.
you yeah, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So
So what then led to your interest in slavery, I can't say that word,
corporeality.
corporeality? Yeah.
I wrote about like I was working with Raymond Brown, who was a very who was my doctor father, and he was very sort of old school, certain kind of, and I wanted to work with him, and I learned a ton with him from
Mhm,
him, and so I needed something that I could work with him. So I would say, like in graduate school, I always had two bookshelves. One was my biblical studies bookshelves, and then the other was like everything else I was reading in feminist theory. A lot of my
mm,
influences are very secular, so feminist critical theory, literary theory, all sorts of stuff. So I
mm.
was just reading this, and I knew I wasn't writing like that for Ray. Like Ray would have been very polite to me, but we would have been like, "What the heck is this?" It just, and I just
Yeah,
wanted to get through, and
yeah,
I just
gotcha.
wanted to get through. So I wrote
Yeah,
it, and it was a school exercise, and I made a couple stabs at publishing parts of it, and
yeah,
it would have been fine. Like it would not have been an embarrassment if it were in the world,
okay.
but it's not, and that's fine. And
And you're okay
at a
with it.
certain point, I had a certain point where I had to make a decision, am I going to revise it for
Uh-huh,
publication?
right.
And everyone said, "Yes, revise it." And I was like, "No, I'm moving on. Like I'm moving on." And so, um, one summer, and it was like in about 6 weeks, I wrote an article, and it was sort of the first independent article I wrote, and it was called "The Accused: Susanna and Her Readers."
Huh,
And, it's at the time there was a movie starring Jodie Foster called The Accused,
uh-huh.
and it was about, I don't know if you remember the movie, but it's about, and this is why you should never give your articles or, books cute, trendy
Mm,
titles, because 30 years later, people are not gonna get the
not gonna
reference.
get the joke. Yes,
And
the
it's still like
play.
a decent article, right? But,
Yep.
so The Accused is, the movie with Jodie Foster is that she's, raped, and, and what she ends up doing is suing the bystanders, who so they
For just
become the
watching.
accused for who just watched this happen. And so I said the accused, Susanna and her readers, because she's accused, but I'm also saying her readers are accused. So it was really about how
Huh.
sort of like how this becomes constructed as a seduction, which is what it's always called. If you know the story of Susanna and Daniel 13, it's in the apocryphal or deuterocanonical writings.
I'm
Um,
not
I
familiar
mean,
with it.
she's Susanna is this wealthy Judean woman, and she's in her garden, and she's taking a bath, and there are a couple of enslaved attendants, and they're watching her, but there are these two creepy old guys, and they conspire to accuse her of adultery, and they say, "Have sex with us, or else we're going to accuse you of adultery," which is a
Huh.
death sentence. So
Huh.
she chooses to be,
Huh.
she chooses to like not have sex with them,
Huh.
and so she's on trial for her life, and Daniel defends her.
Aha.
So this is always called a seduction, and I'm like,
What? It's
yeah,
called
it
a
was,
seduction?
well, it was until 1993 when I
Right.
published The Accused, and I was like, this is not like maybe one or two, but I was like, look, but I was also then looking at the dynamics of that story and how that gets set up as a seduction when it's not a seduction, it's
There's
a
not
rape. Like,
yeah,
look,
right.
you're like, it's an
Right. This is a
attempted rape.
yeah.
It's not a rape because but it's an
Right.
attempted rape. So
Yes.
how do we do that? So I'm looking at that point,
Huh.
like, and I remember the article came out, and I get this letter from Ray Brown. And he's like, "Well, I see you're, I didn't." He said, "I didn't see that coming." Right. So, but he was very supportive of me, and it was
Nice.
fine. And
Nice.
so I was like trying out different critical theories and different lenses, and
Yeah.
writing about different stuff. And then there was this question that my students had asked me back at Union in the 80s, because the graduate program at Columbia is a joint program with Union Theological Seminary. And so I was asked questions about by these Masters of Divinity students who wanted to write about, slavery in the New Testament was one of the possible topics for their research paper, that I was the teaching assistant that I guess Robin Scoggs or someone had assigned
Huh.
them.
Uh-huh.
And, like, they told me they couldn't find anything, so I'm like lifting myself up to my full height, like, "I will help you find these materials," right? Well, there weren't, like, there was very little. There was Scott Bartschy's book, which for its time was good, and you're like, "There's just nothing." So I had these questions about slavery and how that functioned since then, and they were
Huh.
always related to questions about gender for me, because there were a lot of enslaved people were, yeah, yeah. So I believe for some time adultery was by definition the woman. So this is in can I comment on this thing in
Please do.
this? Is
Yes,
that
please
too
do.
like
Yep.
distracted?
Yep.
People are talking about
That's fine.
adultery. So it's always the woman who's the adulteress. So I actually have my students, I ask them to define adultery, and I love my students. They're very,
Yep.
very sweet. So they're
Yeah.
like, adultery is like when you cheat on your partner. And I'm like, okay, right. So, but they're very sweet. And so
Yeah.
they're like very sweet, and they're very young. And so like this is very non-binary for
Right.
them, and
Yes. Yes.
whatever fluid part. And then they get into these discussions. Well, suppose you're like seeing someone, but then they're sexting with someone else. Is that adultery? And I'd let that go for a minute. And I'm like, it's okay, whatever. And I say, so in the ancient world, this is I think Roman law, it's Greek law, it's Jewish law, and this really becomes Christian law. Adultery is sex between a married woman and a man who's not her husband. And so, according to ancient legal norms, if a man is married and he has sex with a prostitute, it's not adultery.
Not a
If
problem.
a man is married and he has sex with a divorced woman or a widow,
Right.
it's not adultery. He's not impinging on someone else's property
Property.
rights. If he has sex with history is such a jerk. If he has sex with, sort of the freeborn, respectable daughter of some guy, he may be committing a different kind of crime or
Mhm.
infraction, but it's not technically adultery. Like that's a specific thing, and because it refers to the marital status of the woman, and so that it does come down to property, and then that eventually. See, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because that also then is in antiquity why it wasn't most people, it was for most people who were writing laws and so forth, sexual access to enslaved women, like they couldn't, you know that was not seen as adultery.
Right.
It might be seen as wrong in certain contexts, it might be seen as okay in certain
Mhm.
contexts, but
Mhm.
it would not technically be adultery. Anyway, so I forget where we
That's
were. Jennifer, I got so off track.
No, it's
Man, I am
okay.
so off track here.
It's okay. I appreciate you responding to the comments and,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
offering some
yeah.
input there on that. Yeah. Um, you were talking about, you know, the piece, what got you into talking about slavery in
Oh,
early
yeah.
Christianity
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
graduate
yeah,
students and trying to
yeah,
help them.
yeah,
You realized there wasn't much.
yeah.
We need to do
So,
something about that. But that kind of lingered for you. And it was always about
yeah,
gender
yeah,
also for you. Yeah. Yeah. I
yeah,
love that that this kind of focus for many years for you now has started with curious graduate students or students, people you were
yeah.
working with and their questions. And then there's a big void there for you to engage.
And and then I started looking for stuff, and, around the time that I began doing research, one of the things that happens is that a lot of my influences are from outside of biblical studies. So in the field of classics, a lot of people started to do some really important work. Keith Bradley was important for me, important work on slavery in the Roman world. And I was like, oh, we're actually talking about the Roman world here. So let's figure out the ways that Christianity either looks like that,
Ugh,
or let's look at the ways. Well, it's different. Like if it's different, but let's look at the moments of resistance.
huh,
Yeah. So
huh.
that would, yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
It's nice to hear that.
Yeah.
Um, I'd love to. I'm trying to figure out a good question to ask you to to give you a chance to talk about specifically slavery and early Christianity. And I'm wondering if, just starting here, are there two, like, I have one or two things that I like to point out to people just to help them reframe for
Mhm,
themselves around this language and
mhm,
as we find it
mhm,
recorded in the Newer Testament texts.
mhm.
So I'm wondering what you like, if someone were to say, okay, what are like the top 3 takeaways from your book? Like, what, that, like, this, if you took these nuggets really seriously, it would change something for people. Is that too much? Is that too small of a list? Can you do 3?
Okay. I'm gonna go do a little
You
story time before I answer that question, at
please,
least point 1.
please.
So Toni Morrison was a really big influence on me, and I'll give you 2, like, weird Toni
Mm.
Morrison things about me. One is that when I was in graduate school, I worked as an editorial assistant at a magazine that's long since out of business. It had to do with women's health issues, and,
Oh, cool.
it was just 'cause it paid I had an opportunity to do it, and it made so much more money, and it might sound sort of glamorous, but a lot of it was doing stuff like fact
Uh-huh,
checking.
uh-huh.
And so fact checking, for those who don't know, is like a story. It's story time within story time. It is fact checking then would be like, okay, someone has taken out an ad for lipstick and the color is pink peony, but now you're going to have some copy, some story in the magazine that's going to sort of reference that product, but here it's called peony pink instead of pink peony. So
Right.
fact checking is like calling the lipstick company and going like, well, which is it?
Which
We
is it?
need to, like we get this consistent here. So it's like really not a glamorous job. And so one day this editor calls me into her office and goes like, have you ever read Toni Morrison?
Hmm.
And I go, yeah, a Song of Solomon, one of my favorite books, is really great. She goes, well, I just had someone write this. Toni Morrison is coming out with a new book. So this is like 1986, 87.
'Kay.
This new book is called Beloved. And I just got someone to write a book review of Beloved. And I think it's too good. And
The
she'd
review
asked,
was too good?
well, the editor hadn't read it, right? Like we didn't know what Beloved was going to be, right? So she
Yeah.
said, so this, and she'd asked Gloria Naylor, who is a Black woman novelist, a
Right, yeah.
fabulous novelist, Women of Brewster
Ebony.
Place, to review this book. And she said, I don't want to be really embarrassed. Like Gloria Naylor is saying there's going to be American literature before Beloved and after Beloved. And that
Huh.
seems like a little like I don't want to be really embarrassed about this. So
Huh.
she said, would you read Beloved? And tell me if you think the review is over the top. Toni Morrison is fantastic. So I
Yes.
read Beloved. My
Mhm.
copy of Beloved is I should have brought it today. It's uncorrected page proofs, like it's because it hasn't been published yet. And I
That's
read
so
it, and
cool.
I'm read it, and I'm like, so I
It's
read the
amazing.
review, and I'm like, and I got the editor, and I go like, I think this is a huge coup. You got Gloria Taylor to
Yeah.
review
Nail
this
it, right?
amazing, amazing novel. But there were a couple things that were wrong with the review, and I was like, "Well, just fix those." And the editor's like, "No, no, no, we don't just fix Gloria Naylor's prose." And I'm like, "Well, this is what you talk to Gloria Naylor about." And she's like, "Oh no, you're going to talk to Gloria Naylor." I went I'm on the phone with Gloria Naylor talking about Toni Morrison, like it
Oh
was
my gosh.
incredible. And one of the things I would say is that one of the epigraphs to slavery in early Christianity is
Oh.
from Beloved.
Um,
Everybody knew what she was called, but nobody anywhere knew her name. Disremembered and unaccounted for. She cannot be lost because no one is looking for her. And even if they were, how can they call her if they don't know her name? So, so that was like, that's one Toni Morrison thing.
mhm,
And then when I
mhm.
get to
Hmm.
Syracuse, I was like very poor, very, very poor. I mean, like postgraduate student poor, hired at a terrible rate. They underpay me by accident for a few years.
Oh,
I kid
geez.
you not, like I
Oh,
kid
geez.
you not. Like, and then like after 2 years, they were like, hey, we've been underpaid. I don't mean like they were paying me like 18,000 a year. It wasn't like they gave me a raise, but it turned out that they were doing my paychecks wrong. So and like I had never noticed, like I was
Yeah.
broke. So I was like really, not in a wealthy neighborhood. There was
Not yeah.
nowhere to walk. Coming from Manhattan, I just wanted to walk somewhere. Like I could walk the following places. I could walk to a pizza place where you'd get a slice for lunch.
Okay.
I could walk to a strip club if I chose, but I did not
Okay.
choose
Okay.
as,
Uh-huh.
that was not
Mhm.
my choice.
Not your thing. Mhm.
And I could walk to a bookstore
Oh,
that
for
was
real?
called My Sister's Words, a feminist and lesbian bookstore.
Hold
So I'm
on.
like, "Oh my god, like, there's nothing here but, except My Sister's Words," run
Right.
by the Mary Ellen Cavanagh, wherever she is. Thank God for Mary Ellen. And I
Oh,
bought this, book by Toni Morrison, a book of essays,
huh.
and it's called Playing in the Dark, and
Yes.
it's a book of essays, and it is about what Toni Morrison says is a fabulous book. She's lots of, but she says you're reading this canonical American literature from the 19th century, and it's about individual freedom, right? And it's not referencing slavery or Black people, but why do we become so obsessed with this individual freedom in a world that has this endemic, very visible enslaved Africanist population? Um, and so one of the things, starting to write about slavery in the world of early Christianity was that's what I thought, oh, that's what biblical scholarship is. It says, yeah, slavery is all over the place in the Roman world, but it has nothing to do with the church. And I'm like, really? We developed this obsession with spiritual freedom, all for it, but like this has nothing to do with the fact that people are visibly enslaved around the empire. So part of what I would like people to take from it, this sense of the book, or what I think is sort of the ubiquity of slavery. And once you see it, and then you're like, well, I don't know. I don't really read anything about slavery in the Gospels. You're like, have you read the parables? Like, like you read anything like Handbook on Parables, and it's always like it's an agricultural world.
Mhm.
There are seeds and there are farmers, and I'm like, yeah, there are actually more slaves than seeds and farmers. I mean, count them. Like it's just there. So this is
We're
whatever's going
taught
on.
to not see it or look the other way when it happens and just brush it under the carpet, right?
And so this is here, and then we start seeing slave actors and enslaved people, I would say, and enslavers everywhere in these works. And I would tend to say enslaved people, enslavers,
Mhm.
but I'm not. I try not to be pedantic about it.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, once you start, so Quinn says, once you're seeing on every page, just on every page, it's just
Yeah.
you see it. It's so that's one thing. I really, from the outside, I've really focused on issues related to gender and slavery, and it's really the enslaved person is sexual property, um, and whether that enslaved person is male or female, especially young men, in the wider whatever was going on, whatever was or was not going on in Jewish homes, certainly in the wider Greek-speaking Roman world and Roman world, enslaved young men, boys were sexual property, were used sexually, and enslaved girls and women were always sexual property. And so um, it, it, so that's I just sort of thinking what difference, because people would say, well, how bad was slavery really? And I was like, well, among other things, if we value this, and it also calls into question from the outset, like if you say, well, anyone could join the church, really? Could a prostitute, were they welcome in the church? I mean,
Uh-huh.
there's evidence that, I mean, Jesus says, people who are prostitutes will enter the kingdom out of the righteous Pharisees, but
Right. But does that what
but
yeah, is that
they
how
did
it's
that. You read First
addressed?
Corinthians, and you're like,
Yes.
I don't think they're. And most prostitutes are enslaved people. They didn't. It wasn't like, hey, I could be a
Streetwalker?
secretary, I could be
Yeah.
a nurse, I could be a prostitute. You know, they were enslaved. Like most people who are sex workers historically, not always.
Yeah.
Some people have chosen it, but they are
Right.
prostituted.
Right.
And so
Right.
throughout the Roman Empire, most prostitutes were enslaved people. Um, so yeah, so that would
Yeah.
be another thing that I would um, take from it. Um,
It does
and
that
yeah,
really does shift a big that shifted a
yeah,
big piece for me in
yeah,
reading your work.
yeah,
That correspondence in First Corinthians
yeah.
chapter 5.
And people would say, people like at the beginning, well, people must have known it was wrong. Like, really, if you're living
Mm,
within,
right, right.
part of it is if you're living within um, a, a ethical or moral system, then y- you don't see the limitations of that system. And so when you're reading, for example, the pastoral epistles and you have like, oh, keep your house in order and everything, what that means in the Roman world is if you have a house, then you need to control people, like you need to
Right.
control their behavior. And in fact, if you're not doing that, then you are derelict because you're not controlling them. So I think it's a really hard and painful thing to see it, to make that shift. Um, yeah, and I would also people are saying such nice things. You have such nice readers here,
Yeah,
such
I'm
nice
just
readers
putting
and
this up real
listeners.
quick.
Um,
Do you know Josh?
yes,
Do you know Josh Bowen?
I do know who you are.
Yes,
Yes, I do.
yes,
I do. So
thank you.
so yeah. So I guess that would be. I would want people to be aware of that. One thing I was aware of when I was working on this, although I said I don't have some. I have like I have the trauma of a 64-year-old woman who, when she was living in Philadelphia in 1982 to 84 and living in New York from 84 to 90, could never, ever, ever, ever walk down the street without some guy saying, "Would it kill you to smile?" You know what I mean? And I'm
Totally,
like,
yes.
you're like, "Wow," like, it's just incredible. Like, so, but like, that's something I don't have a big I just have that sort of constant drip, 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 drip,
Yeah,
drip thing. I
yeah.
mean, I could probably come up with some worse things than the drip, 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 but most of it is just like
Mhm.
drip, 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 just sort of wearing away. And,
Yeah.
uh, uh, but I did have friends, too many friends, I'm sorry to say, who had grown
Mm,
up with sexual violence in the home
mm,
or in their
mhm,
religious communities, whether those religious communities were Protestant or Catholic.
mhm, mhm.
Uh, Conservative, actually not conservative,
Yeah.
within the homes, with fathers, with other relatives who weren't protected. But you think about something like for how long it took people to see and to recognize that harm, and
Mhm.
some people would say, it must have been obvious that it would be wrong to have sex with an enslaved person. Why was it obvious? Like, I can take you
Exactly.
back to the 1950s where if it turned out that a priest was having sex with a 13-year-old girl, she had to apologize to him for seducing her,
So right,
for
cheering him
seducing
on.
him.
Mhm,
Like, "I'm sorry I
mhm.
was a temptress." Like, and we're like,
Uh-huh.
"Ooh," like, this turns my stomach, it turns
Right,
my guts, right?
right.
But it takes a while for people to go like, "Oh, boy,
Really messed up.
that's really, really messed up." Yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah.
constantly just I'm sorry about the attack. It's just horrible. So anyway, so I don't say like to bring that, so people who say it must be obvious, like, it must be obvious. Like, no,
Mm,
I don't
mm.
think it was obvious. I
I
don't
don't
think it
mhm.
I don't know about you, Jennifer. I'm older than you, but when I was growing up, used to see parents hitting their kids in public on
Yeah,
the
for
regular,
sure.
like, just like now we'd be like, do that, but,
Yep,
and my
yep.
family didn't do that or anything, but
Uh-huh.
like,
Yeah.
it
Just a thing, yeah.
was just a thing,
Spanking, swatting, whatever
like,
kind of whatever
yeah,
to get them in
yeah,
line.
yeah, so,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
And this is I think this is one of the more interesting things about biblical texts and people's insistence on, you know, of course it was obvious to them, right? Because when you can help people see that we are still doing it today, like choose your issue in the last 100 years, right?
Right.
Women getting a vote, equal rights amendment, like whatever it is, and then point to the realities of this may be on the books.
Right.
It's not even being
Right.
lived out yet, right?
Right. Right.
For us, why would it be any? And so there's something helpful to be able to make those kinds of comparisons
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You gave us 3 takeaways.
I gave us
You
those
give 2.
2.
Yeah, okay. But
And
those
so
are
I
big
think,
ones. Those are 2
yeah,
really big
or
ones.
maybe 3, because
Big
I think I
differences.
sort of like the ubiquity
Yeah.
and then the sexual use of
Gender.
slaves, but
Yes,
also
you did.
then, but then also, the sort of like how hard it is, how moral change is really hard.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see those points when there is some resistance and, um,
Yeah.
and again, like, this is really hard to talk about because people will say, "Well, Jesus couldn't have ended slavery," and I'm like, "Yeah, but he could have stopped slavers from being baptized. If there were certain sexual behaviors that if you engaged in them, it seems you were thrown out of the church, sleeping with your father's woman, it could get you thrown out. So there were, certain sexual behaviors that could prevent you from joining, but
Mhm.
slaving was not something that prevented
Mhm.
people. And of
Right.
course, this is one of the things in the American context that breaks with certain Southern and Northern churches. Not that I would ever say the Northern churches or universities or structures were innocent in slaving. They profited immensely from them, as we know.
Right.
So I would not, so lots of wrong to go around. Um, so, uh, what was I saying there?
Oh, dear. Oh, I'm like, I was
Help
trying to think
me,
of one.
help me.
I know, I was trying to think of the next
Okay,
thing I was gonna ask you.
was right. Let's start
Now
again.
I'm very yeah, I just hit a wall. Um, yeah, so okay, so enslavement,
Oh,
right,
slavery was
the
allowed by Jesus. I
yes,
just
the
want to say, yeah,
obviousness.
thank you, Smitty. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I mean, so like again, what did he say? Did he disapprove of it? He doesn't address it directly. He used it as in his teaching.
Exactly.
He says, be slaves to one another, which is really disrupting sort of the kyriarchy. So I think there are things we can do about it if we're preaching it or working with it in churches, but it's not a direct challenge. And the other thing I would say is at the time that Jesus was of Jesus' ministry, there was a group of of apocalyptically oriented, I'd say messianically oriented Jews known as the Essenes, and they were reputed to, or it was said that they opposed slaving, that they did not
Hmm,
own slaves because they
hmm,
thought it was wrong.
hmm,
Philo says it. Josephus says it.
hmm.
I mean, Philo and Josephus are fine with slaving.
Right,
Philo's
right.
a first century Jewish philosopher, and Josephus is a first century Jewish historian, and they're both fine with slaving. Believe me, they're fine with it. But they talk about this group of actually several groups of Jews, both the Essenes and the Therapeutae, who are said
Huh,
to reject slaving. And
huh,
so
huh,
it was possible. I would say is I don't even know it's true about those groups. I don't know
uh-huh,
if the Therapeuta existed. I don't know if the
uh-huh.
Essenes really did reject slaving, but it was
Right.
possible to imagine it. Like in the first century, it was actually possible to imagine, if not eliminating slaving from the empire, it was at least possible to imagine a
Hmm,
community
hmm.
joined in devotion and piety who
Huh.
rejected slaving. And so that's a really hard thing too. Like you can't
Yep.
say, well, it was impossible for someone to think of
Yeah,
because
it
people who
wasn't.
had a lot of overlap um, uh, with with Jesus and his
Yep.
thinking in a lot of ways did. So it's hard.
Thank you for that. That's actually a really helpful nugget because and that's one of the things I like, "Oh gosh, how do I help people see
Yeah.
this element of Jesus and the way he's depicted?" That it's in his words, it's in the way he talks about things. That's it's a challenge to me that it's kind of a personal challenge I've
Mhm,
taken up
mhm,
since reading your
mhm,
work.
mhm,
How do I just slowly kind of introduce this for people, invite them to see something
mhm,
slightly
mhm,
differently? Um,
mhm.
I have several other questions, and I don't know which one to ask, and I don't know to go on a different topic. I'm curious though, in particular when it comes to
I'm just
Paul.
laughing at some of your comments. That's
Oh,
all. That's all.
sure,
Just like I,
please.
if
Do you
I
want me to
look
put
like
one up? I'm
no,
not.
it's just like I'm sure the slave owners all agreed slavery was good. The slavers, yeah, we're pretty fond of it. I'm trying not to laugh too not much
It's
when I see
okay.
what's over there.
You
So
you can
yeah.
yeah. It's fine. It's fine. I'm glad you're enjoying it. You know, I don't remember. I think it was I read Joe Marshall's Joe Marshall, who now goes by Jay, piece on Onesimus and
Mhm.
the and he was the one, and he was working with your work on that, and the taking more seriously that it's a play on words and it's actually Paul's being a jerk. Like Paul's just really being a jerk there,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
In the language he's using and essentially mocking the usefulness of Onesimus. Um,
Yeah.
do you want? Can you say anything about that, or is that I don't know.
No, I mean, I can. I actually, I disagree with Jay partly on the reading of that, and
Oh,
I always cite him.
okay,
No, I actually always cite him. I think that people
yeah,
should read his article
uh-huh,
and think about it.
okay, yeah,
I think that, and I agree with a lot that what he says, and then I diverge at a certain point,
great,
which is
great.
I think that he thinks I think he thinks that it's possible that Onesimus is being used sexually
Mhm,
by Paul and Philemon, and I actually don't. And
uh-huh,
I think that I mean, among other things, if you look at all the uses of the word use, if we think about that in English, because it's crisis of very similar sort of range in English and Greek. If I lined up all the instances in which that word is used, it's hard because I'm using used.
yes,
If it's all the instances where sexual use appears, you think that's what it always meant, but there are a lot of other ways that people are used,
uh-huh,
and people are used in a lot of other ways in enslaved systems and systems of enforced labor.
yeah,
In the world today, if you look, there's horrible people sort of contemporary enforced
yes,
trafficking
sure,
involving sexuality, but also involving, whatever is in your cell phone, other all sorts of mining practices, salt mining, like that, all
labor,
sorts,
exploiting labor, and mhm,
people are used in all sorts of ways,
mhm,
um, and I think for me, if you know Nat Turner, who led a slave revolt, one thing is that he says is, like I refused to, I was useless. Like he tried to be useless. Like that was his goal, to be useless. Um, and so like so that can have a sexual connotation. But I think that if Jay had taken in a wider selection of the ways that word is used, I don't know that I would come to the same conclusion he does about that
okay.
text. And people should read his article because he may be right and he may be wrong. And I would always, always, always cite it whenever I could. I thought it was great. I thought it was great that it appeared in JBL. I was not a reader for it when it came out, but I think it's an important piece to think
To
with.
consider, yep,
Yeah.
to yep, mull
Yeah.
over. I appreciate
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
do, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
toyed with how to handle
Yeah.
that, and I've had students who didn't grow up in a Christian setting, and their first reading of it is to read it through a like, it just seems to them like
Mhm.
there's a sexual relationship going on here somewhere, and again, yeah,
Right. Right.
I appreciate having this conversation with you that I can refer to, so that's
Okay.
great. I want to do a quick, sharing this,
So
just
sweet.
because yes, thank you for the super chat, Digital Hammurabi. Please trust me, if you don't have both Dr. Bird's book on marriage and Dr. Glancy's new edition of her slavery book, get them both now. Um, I
Exactly.
I know, isn't that lovely? Thank you for the plug. Um, can I ask about slavery as a moral problem, or are
Mhm.
we, I'm going to share the book cover here because it's fun to do. Let's just do that. I think it's an interesting cover. I appreciate the subtlety and not all at the same time on that. Slavery is a moral problem in the early church and today. Is there a what would you like to tell us about this book of yours?
Okay, first I want to comment on April Van Ryn. The slavery laws were set up so that slave had a certain amount of rights, including being fed. That's a complicated thing, I would say. And why would anyone want to be a slave? There were limited instances. It's possible that in the Roman world, some very small percentage of people did sell themselves into slavery. And I think actually that. That's true. I think that a very small number of people, like, it's not a major source of slaves, but they probably would have done it, for example, I mean, actually, there were a number of things. One of them is a scam. One of the things in the Roman world, he set up a scam in which someone sells you into slavery, and then takes the money for you, and then you produce documentation showing that you're free. And then you split the sale price, and that's one of the instances in which a free person then can be enslaved. Like, okay, you participated in the scam, you can be enslaved. But there were people who somehow sold themselves into slavery, into the household of Caesar, which actually
Mm.
could bring a fair amount of influence, and even if you couldn't own wealth yourself, you would
You had direct
have
access to
some
it. Yeah.
access to luxury, and
Uh-huh.
lead then becoming a freed person of that household. So this happened, and I guess I always feel like it's overplayed. Like, it's not like people
Mm.
were going around selling themselves into slavery all the
Yeah.
time. If
Right.
it happened, it's very, very occasionally. People
Yes.
do all sorts of things. So that would be that. Um, One of the things I do in slavery, a small problem,
Yeah.
is I failed to do in slavery and early Christianity, is I talk a little bit about the slave laws in the Hebrew Bible, in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, and because and and I'm doing with my current book project, I'm actually doing more with that,
Okay.
because one of the reasons I do that is that it when I was talking about slavery, and people would think about biblical slavery, they're often thinking about those slave laws. And one of the things I would always hear is, but it wasn't really slavery because it was only for 7 years. So what you need to know about the biblical slave
Sorry.
laws, well, to begin with, actually, if you know anything, I always was like, actually, if you know anything about bonded labor, even temporary enslavement it can be really pretty awful.
Pretty awful. Yeah, it's still
And
enslavement,
so
even if
enslavement,
it is for 7 years.
and if you go into Leviticus, the holiness code, which is the latest of this text, it's a 50-year period. Well, you're enslaved when you're 20. You're probably not going to outlive it, right?
Get
So,
out of it.
I
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so it, I it, so but those passages in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, Exodus, the holiness code being the earliest, then Deuteronomy, then Leviticus, they're all speaking very specifically of the enslavement of fellow Israelites.
Huh?
And if you go and look at the passage, and I'm Catholic upbringing, even though I'm writing about this, I can't do chapter verse. Wish I were kidding. In Leviticus, it's very clear, and it says, well, they won't. Leviticus won't use the word aved ama about an Israelite. They won't call that person a slave,
Oh.
an enslaved person.
Huh.
They reserve that for foreigners, and they go like, oh yeah, no, you
Oh.
can't. It's not like the foreigners. You can buy them and sell them and abuse them. So
Hmm.
it's not that it's forbidding slavery. It's not that it's limiting slavery. They are specifically limiting the enslavement of fellow Israelites. And then you go, well, that's cool. Like, it's good that they couldn't enslave fellow Israelites. Romans didn't enslave Romans. Like, Greeks didn't enslave Greeks. Alexandrians didn't, enslave Alexandrians.
Huh.
People were enslaved because they were seen as being other. So there is this time limit put on the bondage or servitude of Israelites, and that plays out differently in these three different texts, but it doesn't limit chattel slavery per se, as in buying, selling human beings who are seen as being ethnically other from you. So that's one thing that I talk about there. I try to help people see, like, a lot of the questions that are we coming that we're coming up with today, or that people may be raising in the chat. I try to address them, and people will say, the true slavery is spiritual slavery or something. And so I talk about, like, well, okay, well, imagine being a child raised in slavery, and imagine being a child raised with that kind of abuse and that kind of self-image. Like, are you really going to grow up to be this free, spiritually free person if you're,
Right.
like,
Right.
say what you will about Christianity, we know something about human psychology too.
Yeah.
Like, this is going to shape who you become, and especially if you're raised to see yourself as someone's sexual property. People who talk about slavery, real slavery, physical slavery, doesn't matter,
Mm.
are not talking about little kids, and they're not talking about women who are sexual property.
Mhm.
So So
Right.
those are that, but I just sort of go through some of these other things, and I also try to include some moments of hope in slavery
Mm.
and early in as moral problem, because moments of hope is something that normally has to be pointed out to me. Like I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. People invite me to preach. They tend not to invite me a second time. I mean, I've had people like I think the last time I preached might have been Palm Sunday. And people were like, "That was great. I'm so depressed," and I'm like, "Yeah."
Well, you're also probably being a little more honest about what the texts are saying. I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna take a guess that, a guess
Yeah,
at that one.
probably. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably.
But also
Bundle of fun.
interesting that as a Catholic, you're being asked to preach. That's kinda nice, I guess, a
Oh,
female Catholic.
yeah,
Yeah,
I've been preached,
yeah,
yeah, so
yeah.
anyway,
Nice.
yeah.
Um,
I
well,
think it's called delivering the homily.
Oh, that's true. It's not the whole delivering the
If we don't have
yes.
a sermon, we have a homily. Get to
Okay.
deliver the homily.
My apologies.
In
Yes.
many cases, you can, depending on the church, although there's a Catholic church in Syracuse for anyone do anything, but, I know those where those churches are, but, like, typically, you might not be allowed to read the gospel, but you'd be allowed to deliver the homily.
I just can't. Okay. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, because okay, yep, just gonna leave that one out there, okay? Um, what, this is the point in the stream, everyone, where if you have other specific questions, I've seen that obviously Jennifer, Dr. Glancy has been engaging your comments throughout, which has been really lovely. I appreciate No, I'm serious. I
No,
appreciate that.
I'm reading the chats. I
You're
mean, if
you're
I
laughing
get
at the
to
chats.
heaven
Yes.
after an entire
Yes.
lifetime of being enslaved, I'm gonna have some complaints for the boss. Didn't Solomon's son treat the northern tribes as slaves? Yes, yes, yes. Anyway, so okay.
Yep. Um So, are any other specific questions for Jennifer? This would be the time to ask them so that we can do those here now that we're wrapping up. I was wondering if there were other comments that I could throw up there while we're waiting to see if
Well, Courtney Brown says it's hard for me to accept that this enslavement of other people in biblical times doesn't equal racism. I've heard racism referred to as a modern problem. I think this is a really great, a really, really great comment here. And what I would say is that I think I would begin by saying that the modern notions of race that arise in the wake of the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade are really distinctive historically. And there's an anti-Black racism that emerges that's transatlantic and is really pernicious and is really, really damaging. And I think that something distinctive does happen there. Having said that, to say that slavery is not do I sound too much like a teacher here?
No.
So I would say that in antiquity, slavery is not racialized the way it was in the modern world, but slavery was still racialized, and I don't think we've come to terms with what that meant in specific places. And I think that's sort of what is the concept of racism in antiquity. And there are a number of people who have written about this.
Yes.
Um,
Denise
I
Kimber Buell comes
Dennis
to
Kimber
mind. Yeah.
Buell has
Mhm.
written about it. I think about the late gay Byron, and I hate to say the late gay Byron because I can't believe she died, but it's a
I
great book on
know.
symbolic blackness in the Bible. I mean, there's
Yep.
certainly concepts
Yep.
of blackness and of race, how those intersect with race. In the Roman world, they're not. If in the Roman world, um, um, uh,
Blackness
the
and race. Yeah.
blackness was were not necessarily being enslaved, but on the other hand, the slavery is happening along racial ethnic lines, and race and ethnicity are defined in terms of your parentage, but they're also defined in terms of what language you speak, what your cultural traditions are, what place of your relation to. So there's a fluid notion of ethnicity or race, but there's a very strong sense. I think that slavery is racialized or ethnicized in ways that we have not adequately addressed. And then we also haven't adequately addressed the way that those uh, with those play out today. So I'm just looking at some of
Mhm.
these
Yep.
questions here, and I won't
Yeah.
be able to answer the
So I'm just gonna go ahead and
yeah
read that. Just so,
yeah.
yeah, Igor Chernyavsky.
I have not looked at this question for a long time. I think we actually do know from the language and I mean, I haven't thought about this particular question for 20 years, so
Okay.
I could be really wrong here. But I think that we know that the concubine was a freeborn woman. I think we know
Mhm.
that, but
Yeah,
I'm not utterly sure about that.
right.
And Augustine actually has is kind of interesting about his ideas about about Augustine
Slave.
on slavery is very, very complicated,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so that's a whole other really complicated and influential piece there. But I
Mhm.
think we know that, but that's a great question, and I wish I were a little sharper in my answer here.
Mm, yeah.
Um, uh,
And was she African? I mean, he was African.
right.
I mean, I don't know how to address that aside from the location, right? In terms of
Oh, was she African? I, d- I- he was right. He was African. I don't. I'm trying to think where he was when the liaison
right,
happens. I can't
right.
remember if he's in Italy or if he's in
Yeah,
Africa.
yeah.
Um,
Okay.
when I go on vacation, I leave my cat in charge. Um, uh,
So, can you throw those titles in the chat? I'm assuming you mean
yeah,
the books that have come up in the conversation? Is that what you all mean? Or do you mean her titles? I can do both.
yeah,
I'll
yeah,
pull
yeah,
some of those. Yep.
yeah.
Um,
So I would say, again, April, we'd have to talk tribal versus racial. I think it would depends if we're thinking. This is April Van Ryn's question. If we're defining race
this
as the
one?
way it's often been described in modern American discourse, then I like when I went to school, among the lies they taught me along when I memorized that there were 7 continents. Like actually, it's like, yeah, no, Eurasia is actually we're define what a continent is, and it's like surrounded by water, and then you're looking at Eurasia, you're going like, really? Like, you're looking at the map, you're like suspended. And like, I was taught when I was in school, like this was science, that there were 3 races. Like I don't think of race that way. So we
Yeah.
would have to talk about how we're defining race today.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
think that in the US and in many other places, it's so defined by a particular kind of sort of racialized trauma of the Middle Passage and in the wake of the Middle Passage. But there's a word. No, I would use race or ethnicity more than tribal, because even tribal is a different. Because I'm talking about racial structures in cities, so I'm looking in, say, the city of Rome or the city of Ephesus or the city of Corinth. This is not a tribal structure. Maybe if we're talking, maybe that might, I guess anthropologically that might work for Genesis, but if we're looking at Rome or Athens, it's not a tribal structure. So I don't think that would be right. I think ethnos is the word that's used, genos for race. But that we would talk more about that because it depends how those terms are defined, and they're not. Anyway,
Yeah. I'm
yeah,
trying to put a couple of these
yeah.
in the chat. So what do you let's see. Here's what what you can do to one of US has always been more oh, I thought that was a
Yes,
question.
to
I'm sorry.
us, yeah, and I think
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
good. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Let's see. Okay. Um,
Denise Kimball Buell's book is, let's see,
why this new race? Is
why
that
this new race? Why
yeah.
this new race?
Yeah.
A really interesting book about the way the discourse of race emerges in early Christianity.
Mm-hmm. So okay, let's see. Slavery is a moral
I guess
problem.
that the overhead projectors, like, and we're taught like this stuff, like it was like garbage science, and we were taught it, and
I
you're like,
know. I know. Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? Why this
mm,
new race? New race. Okay. Okay. So let's see. 11. Sometimes I can't tell if I need to be when I've gathered. It's based on is that what you were just talking about?
mhm.
Revolves around skin. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, it looks like I just major typo there. Why this new race? I
Mhm.
guess I should clarify that in the comment. Why? Okay. Um, thank you. This has been fun, and there were other things we just didn't have time to get to, I think. But thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your story, sharing some of who you are, why you do what you do. thank you for your scholarship, the very important scholarship around this issue of enslavement, slavery, early Christianity, what people are in denial about it in these texts that are very important to them. It's really helpful work, and I appreciate you, Jennifer.
And I think I joined the entire, I was like the entire home audience I taught, hybrid during the pandemic. So I
Yeah.
had some students in class and some of them were at home, and I'd always be like, and my studio audience versus my home audience. So I guess you're all my, so my home, so the, yeah, but I want to join everyone in this. Thank you for participating and for your questions
Yes.
and comments
Yes.
and
Yes.
your good humor.
Mhm.
But also thank
Mhm.
Dr. Bird for organizing the space and facilitating this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, you're
Okay,
welcome. It's been great.
thanks.
All
Okay,
right. I'm kicking you out.
okay, bye. Bye.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I echo Jennifer's comments. Thank you for being here. If you were interested and able to be here live, thanks for watching it later. If you're catching it later, Courtney Brown, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate that, and glad that you were enjoying some of what we're sharing and some of the things we're talking about. And I'm trying to expose you all to scholars and ideas beyond what is typically engaged in this public scholarship realm, and on YouTube and specifically. So thank you for that. Thanks for all the ways you support me. Thank you for sharing, liking a video and subscribing or recommending my work to someone else. It goes a long way. It helps other people find this work, that other people who are like-minded with you find the work, and that's helpful for everybody. So thank you for doing that. And thank you to all those who support me financially through Patreon, who've purchased and read my books and told other people about it. Thank you for all of the different ways. I am grateful. So next week I'll be doing story time. Be back to me, and I'll be responding to that video by Gavin, my own brand of that. So look for that next week. See you then.